Dave's a very humble guy, so he's only given me about 4 sentences on himself, so I'll just read them out so that you know a bit about him. Professor David Stray is the John R. Park Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah in the US. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1989 and worked at GTE Laboratories before joining the faculty at the University of Utah. Professor Strayer's research examines attention and multitasking in real-world contexts, such as driving an automobile, and he's published over 175 scholarly articles in the area, and for the last 15 years has focused on understanding driver distraction stemming from multimodal interactions in the vehicle. And so it's very timely that Dave's here because we're actually working on a project jointly at the moment. It's an international collaboration, and that's what's brought him here now and just a few weeks ago. And so we're also very interested in what he has to say today. So the title of his talk today is Emerging Technology and Distracted Driving from the Model T to the Model S. So thank you very much, Dave. We look forward to your chat.
Thank you, Mike. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming after Anzac Day. I realize that for a lot of you, the choice of basically being able to come here or stay home for an extra day was a difficult choice, and I appreciate you coming to basically share some time. Can you hear me all right, or yeah? I can move it up if you need a little bit more. How's that? Better? Good. So basically there's 3 parts to my talk. I'll be talking a little bit about the history of driver distraction, going back to the Model T and the very early stages of driving, and kind of carrying that through all the way to the most advanced technology that's currently on the road, the Tesla Model S. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the history of distraction. Won't spend a ton of time there, but just kind of go through some of the high points. Then talk a little bit about the theory behind it, and only kind of briefly, because you probably are already largely familiar with these ideas. And then we've been working with the AAA in the US to measure distraction, cognitive distraction, and then more recently distraction from all the kinds of things you can do in the car. And that's funded by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. And so I'll just share kind of snippets of that research that we have done over the last 10 years or so. Just to kind of give you a that might work. So this is an example of what driving was 110 years ago. This is on the streets of San Francisco. It was multimodal. You had all kinds of vehicles. You had the trolley line. You had people just wandering right across the street in horse and buggy. People would just, when they hopped on the back, they'd catch a taxi back then, I guess. But it was the only thing about this. It's kind of bedlam. The only real thing that's kind of making it so that it's not so dangerous is the fact that it's relatively slow speeds. But there's no dedicated passenger lanes. There's no real traffic lights. And so basically it was actually bedlam. And even in this era, about 1 person a day was run over by a horse in New York City and killed. So it wasn't particularly safe. And then, but also distraction emerged as a problem with these early vehicles. So an example of that is the very 2 first cars that were licensed in the state of Ohio to drive on their roads crashed into each other. So distractions have been a problem from the beginning. A critical kind of point in terms of just the history of driver distraction came in the early 1930s. I mark this as kind of an important period of time because This is the first time that they started to introduce technology in the car that had nothing to do with the task of driving the vehicle. Before that, it was mainly just interacting with the car and maybe the passenger. But here they just deliberately added something that had nothing to do with maintaining where you were on the road. It turns out that there was a technology just before that called the highway hi-fi. It was a little record player that plugged into the car. It didn't work so well. Every time you hit a bump, the needle would jump out of the track. At the time that they introduced this, they didn't have any idea whether or not this would be a good or bad thing to do. And in the US, about 5 states actually were considering outlawing listening to the radio while you're operating the vehicle. Well, we now actually know, and I'll show some data later on, that listening to the radio doesn't turn out to be a problem. But about half the people, even back then, thought this could be an issue. At the same time that the cars were being developed, there was a parallel technology, which was the phone. About the same exact late 1800s, almost early 1900s, the telephone began to be something that was commonplace. But for the longest time, that telephone was plugged into a wire into the wall, so that we had no idea whether or not this type of technology would actually interfere or have any interactions at all with driving. And then in 1973, this man, Martin Cooper, developed and patented the car phone. And this is what it looked like, a big, clunky, heavy device that was designed to allow the business person to be able to do their job while they were driving. At the time they patented this, the idea was to improve productivity of the businessman and no concerns at all about whether or not this would be a good or a bad idea. And then the next kind of point in this kind of brief history is the iPhone or the smartphone. The iPhone came out in 2007, and now pretty much just about everybody on the planet owns one. At least in the US, there are more cell phone subscriptions than there are people. So people have more than, in many cases, there are some people who have more than one phone, but just about everybody does. Calling this a phone, it is a phone. You can talk on it, obviously, but it does everything else you can do as well. You can send texts, you can surf the internet, you can interact on social media. And so this device allows people to do pretty much anything that you could do on a computer or any kind of tethered connection. Now with wireless connectivity and Bluetooth capabilities, anything that could be done on that phone now becomes inherited, and so the car inherits a lot of those characteristics and properties and features. Again, not much of any real consideration about whether or not this was good to marry with the car. And this is an example of one of the cars that we're testing now. This is the Tesla Model S. It has a 17-inch display, and it has a dedicated phone port that communicates, and they can send updates to the car. But it also allows the driver to be able to do all kinds of things, interacting with phones, navigation systems, texting. It allows the driver to interact with Facebook while the vehicle is in motion. So anything you could do at your desktop, at least with some cars, you can now do on the road while you're driving. And it leads to situations like this. This is an example of kind of the technology that is being promoted. If we can hear that.
Hey honey, my mom stopped by. We'll see you soon. Hey honey, where the are you going?
We only make one thing, the ultimate driving machine.
So now we're completely integrating all kinds of social media, texting, features like that with driving. If you looked really carefully in that, did anybody notice any kind of disclaimers on that video? About 2/3 of the way through, a little white pop-up around the grass said, "Do not use this technology while the vehicle's in motion." So lawyers know that one ought to not do this, but in terms of advertising, they're advertising that this technology can be used while driving. So I want to give you an example of, now I want to kind of switch gears for a second. From a cognitive neuroscience perspective and from a psychological perspective, Mike and I are really interested in what it means to be distracted. And he's actually written some really elegant kind of a taxonomy on driver distraction, categorizing, what is distraction, how does it differ from inattention, and so forth. And if you have not read that, you really should. It's a landmark piece of work. So I'm interested in, as is Mike, in what is distraction. Let me give you just an example of a type of distraction we see on the roads in the U.S.
All right, so we're driving on the freeway, and I look over, and this guy is reading a book. And wait.
iPad?
I think it's a Kindle. Is that a Kindle and a book?
Yo, dog, I hear you like.
No way. You speed up.
He's on his cell phone.
And a Kindle.
That is multitasking.
And a book.
Mike, I think that would actually characterize, be classified as maybe one or more sources of distraction, inattention in your taxonomy. So, from a neuroscience perspective, I've really been interested in what drew me into looking at driver distraction was how the brain can try and do more than one, or tries to, but oftentimes fails to do two things at the same time. So we define multitasking as trying to do two things at the same time that aren't connected. We wouldn't, for example, characterize and don't characterize multitasking in this case as, say, steering and manipulating the brake and the gas, because those are integrated into the same task of maintaining lane position and speed. What we think about here is trying to do two tasks that are functionally separate, have nothing in common. They're distinct inputs, different goals, different cognitive operations, and different outputs. So you can think about, presumably one of the tasks that driver I just showed you was doing was operating the vehicle. That's one task. At the same time, that driver's shifting attention and reading the book, or diverting attention to look at the Kindle, or diverting attention to talk on the phone. So those latter three tasks don't have anything to do with the task of operating the vehicle. And when we look at this, we think about there's two tasks, and those tasks can actually be formed. What we know people are really doing is kind of switching back and forth. They're doing one task, and they're switching back to the other task, despite the fact that our brains are massively parallel, and we have all kinds of neurons, and there's nothing conceptually why we couldn't, in theory, do these things in parallel. The way human behavior is structured is basically you're switching attention from this task to that, back and forth. And so when you're paying attention to the driving task, your performance on the reading task or the cell phone conversation task is impaired. And when you're switching to the task 2, you're paying attention to that task, and you actually start to see performance decrements in the driving task. And that task switching thing, there's actually a literature, thousands of studies have been published on it. I don't know what this is trying to do, but we don't want it to do that. I do not want that to happen. So basically, you have these two tasks, and not only do you're switching, so you're paying attention to one task and the other, but there are these switch costs, the little lines indicated in green. There's a period of time when it takes the brain to transition from one task to the other and back. And so not only do you have lockout of one task versus another, but in some point of the time, neither task is really getting processing resources. And there's actually thousands of studies that have looked at that. I'm going to show some data today, a fair amount of it actually, that shows that what the psychological studies have done in terms of switch costs drastically underestimate the amount of time it takes where there's this dead zone or carryover from one task to the next. But basically, humans are really only performing one task at a time, and they're switching attention back and forth. And why this matters is that in terms of risk, and the reason that it gets a lot of road safety people interested in distracted driving is that it's crashes as a whole are the number one source in the U.S. of accidental deaths. Over 40,000 people are killed every year, and over the last, say, 20 to 30 years, if you plotted fatalities normalized per million miles driven, there had been a systematic decrease in the number of fatalities. You could chalk that up, I think, into the case of better roads, better vehicle safety, and also kind of better education campaigns where you'd have fewer, still too many, but fewer fatigue or alcohol-related crashes. But in the US, in 2015, that continuous curve all of a sudden spiked up by 7%. That was the biggest increase that they saw in 50 years. So that was like, oh. The next year it went up by the same amount again. And it's gone up again. So there's 3 years in a row of it going back up. And just about 2 weeks ago, they did an analysis looking at even though fatalities have declined overall, some fatalities, for example, pedestrians being hit, is up 35% in the US over the last decade. Mainly, it's probably at intersections, people are being hit by distracted drivers who are texting or are distracted one way or another, or the pedestrians themselves are actually distracted and stepping out into traffic. It's probably some combination of both of those. Distraction seems to, it's difficult to get a clear indication of exactly how many crashes are distracted. I think actually for me, one of the better studies came from work that Dan McGeehee and his colleagues did at Iowa, where they put cameras in cars and they looked at what happened in the 6 seconds preceding a crash. And this is with teens, but 2 out of 3 of the crashes had some type of distraction in that 6 seconds before the crash. So we now see that distractions are a big problem. This is kind of giving an idea of what happens to the brain when someone's distracted from the cognitive sources. And this actually comes from a summary that Don Fisher and I wrote. It says when someone gets on a phone or is cognitively distracted by one activity or another, they don't scan, they stop scanning. They're visual. If you look at an eye tracker, they just tend to stare straight ahead. They don't look in the periphery. Of course, if you're not looking at the periphery, you're not looking in side mirrors, you're not aware of what anything might be happening on either side of the vehicle. And so you just get this kind of tunnel vision. So scanning is impaired. We've done work, and Don Fisher's done probably the best, looking at prediction for hazards. And so what happens is a driver who has experience, when they come to certain locations, they'll anticipate implicitly or explicitly where potential hazards might be. And they'll tend to look to see if there might be something there. Even if there isn't an object there, they may scan to that location to see where a potential threat might be, say a pedestrian walking across a crosswalk. Putting somebody on a cell phone makes an expert driver, in terms of their predictive scanning, look more like a novice driver who wouldn't scan in those directions. There's something called inattentional blindness. That also happens where people don't see things that are right in front of them. So about half of the information that you typically would notice is impaired if you're on a cell phone, for example, or cognitively distracted. You make poor decisions in terms of turning, making lane changes, and so forth, and then your reaction times, executing a response, are impaired. And so scanning, predicting, identification, deciding, and executing a response, or the acronym SPIDER, kind of describes where a lot of the literature looking at what happens with cognitive distraction. And so that kind of framework there summarizes hundreds of studies that have looked at different aspects of driver performance when they're distracted by some cognitive activity. And it may just lead, the solution might be or the problem may actually be, I should say, that we have people who are just walking around functionally blind. They're actually walking across crosswalks or driving where they're simply just not noticing where they're going. Okay, so this won't work, so I'm just gonna, I'm going to talk about the research that we've done with AAA. And so there's a number of studies that kind of build on each other that try and understand cognitive distraction and how we can measure it, and then from that move into the complex multimodal types of interactions that people are doing now in the vehicle. So the first study we did with AAA was said, can you measure cognitive distraction, and can you develop some kind of a systematic framework for rating how difficult the different kinds of activities are? And so in our study we tested we measured how much workload it took to just drive the vehicle without any other distraction. So that's our single task. Then we measured how distracting adding listening to the radio would be to that, or how distracting it would be to listen to a book on tape, or hold a conversation with a passenger who's seated right next to the driver, or having a handheld or hands-free conversation on a cell phone. And then we built an early version of a speech-to-text interface, kind of like what you'd have with Siri. But for most people, Siri doesn't always do exactly what you want. We built one where we actually put a person in the loop so that it was perfect fidelity. Whatever you ask, it would do without fail. So the question is, what happens if, in this case, what happens if Siri is perfect or these voice engines are perfect? And then our last item that we tested, we wanted something at the low end, which was just category 1, single task driving. And the other thing we had was we wanted something at the high end. What we thought at the time would be one of the hardest things was to do something called the operation span task, where you're constantly solving math problems and holding information in memory. It's a task that Randy Engel developed for measuring working memory capacity. It's not that we would expect anyone in the real world would ever try and do this. It's kind of like trying to balance your checkbook while you're driving down the road. But it does give you what we thought was a really high level of cognitive distraction. And hopefully those different activities would fall somewhere below that high water mark. So you can think about that. Category 5 is a high water mark for distractions. And then we took a page, read aviation psychology, where people were trying to measure the workload of a pilot. This actually comes from a model that was developed to measure workload of the Apache helicopter pilot as he's flying a mission. And in our case, we took primary task measures, which measured how well the driver would maintain lane position and just drive the vehicle, brake reaction time, scanning behavior, and so forth. We took a secondary task measure, which is the detection reaction time task. I'll show you what that looks like in a second, but it adds a second task, gives you a very precise measure of residual capacity. We use the NASA Task Load Index. It's a subjective way of assessing workload. NASA uses it to assess this where their astronauts are performing missions in space. And we took physiological measures, brain activity, heart rate, pupil diameter, and so forth. And we took all those different metrics, scaled them, and integrated them to a common workload scale. And when we did, and here's an example of the detection reaction time task. So what happens is, you can't really see this hardly, but there's a light or a vibrotactile stimulus. Here in this case, we have a light that's projected on the windshield. See this little orange glow. When it comes on, the driver just needs to push a little micro switch that is attached to their finger, and we measure reaction time and accuracy. That DRT methodology in various it can be done with a light that's attached to someone's head on a boom or a vibrotactile stimulus. But that DRT technology turns out to be extremely sensitive to how much residual capacity a driver has. The more distracted they are, the more likely they're to be, their reaction times to that light are going to be delayed, or they're just not going to see it altogether. In our studies, when we look at kind of what is the most effective technique, I think the DRT probably is the most effective measure that we've had for measuring workload. And one of the reasons I'm here is colleagues in Hobart and in Newcastle and Brisbane and at UQ and out in Perth are all using this variation to try and understand exactly how it's measuring it. And so there's a lot of active research. But it turns out to be very, very sensitive to workload. As your mental workload increases, you do more poorly on this detection reaction time task. It's now an ISO standard for measuring workload. And we do the tests both in a simulator. So on the left, we have our driving simulator. We have 2 driving simulators. On the right, we have most of our work these days is on-road testing. And we're measuring a bunch of things here on the left. The person's talking on a handheld cell phone as they're driving down the road. On the right, we have somebody, and we're recording EEG in this case. On the right here, you have a person who's driving, and you can see the DRT switch, and you can see the electrodes. We're recording brain activity and a variety of other kinds of things as they're driving in residential sections in Salt Lake City, where I live. And so, cutting to the chase without giving you all the individual pieces of data, I'm happy to provide that if you want to kind of look at this, but there would be more slides than you'd want to see. Single task is here, so that's a category 1 level workload. That's the workload of just driving without doing anything else. And category 5 is that doing the operation span task while you're driving. That's our category 5 level. You can have things like listening to the radio. That does have some measurable effect on workload, but extremely minor. So it's not something that most people in the safety community would be worried about. Even listening to a book on tape, although it is more demanding than, say, just listening to passively to their radio, it's not that distracting. Talking to a passenger is more distracting, especially to the driver. This is where we're measuring the driver's workload, and they're using EEG and a lot of other measures. And it's exactly the same, actually, as talking on a handheld or hands-free cell phone. So those three, in terms of the workload of the driver, are exactly the same. But what we saw with a perfect version of a speech-to-text system that was a precursor, or is a perfect version of what Siri would be, which Siri, of course, isn't perfect, and I'll get to some of that examples in a moment, was a category 3. So that's actually a cause for concern if more and more interactions are voice-based and the workload associated with those interactions is substantially greater than even talking on a cell phone. All the worries that we had about talking on a cell phone now say watch out, because some of that technology may actually be even worse if you're using the voice, speech-to-text type engines. So effectively, there's some stuff. Now what's happening? Let's try it this way then. There we go. So there's some activities that are low enough we're not too worried about in terms of traffic, in terms of traffic safety. They do have an effect on the driver's workload, but they're probably also keeping the driver alert and awake, and so they're just not that worrisome. There's things like talking, or the driver's talking to a passenger, or handheld or hands-free conversation. Those actually kind of are about 2.5 on our workload scale. And they're exact. It doesn't matter if you're talking to a passenger or you're talking to somebody else, it's exactly the same. However, the crash risk is not the same for those three. It turns out that, stop this.
Select the last one.
Select what?
The last one.
This one? Keep it? All right. It's nice that it's helping me. So what we know is that even though the workload the driver's experiencing is the same, in terms of crash statistics, when there's an adult passenger in the car, the odds ratio drops to slightly below 1, which means basically, even though the driver's distracted, the overall crash rate's about the same, or even a little bit less. You're less distracted than if you were just driving by yourself. Anyone hazard a guess as to why that might be? Yeah.
Passengers helping to identify something dangerous.
Exactly. So the passenger's helping out. And so there's a number of studies that have actually looked at the content. What happens is the passenger will say, watch out for that, here's your exit, hey, pay attention. And so you have two sets of eyes, or some redundancy here, which you lack there. Some studies have actually been done where they try and take a video feed and show it to someone who's talking to the driver on a hands-free phone, and they actually make it so that then the hands-free cell phone looks like what happens with the passenger conversation as well. But for us, since this emerging technology and the fact that you can now push a button and do all kinds of things on the car is concerning, because there's been a huge push to try and say, let's actually eliminate visual manual interactions. So you just push a button and then speak and tell something to your car. Well, your car is just going to have probably more problems in understanding what you're doing than Siri would. And so that may not be a good solution. So our second part was trying to understand why is it that using your voice to talk to the car was having the higher levels of workload. One possibility is it could just be synthetic speech. So Siri doesn't sound like a real person, it sounds like a computer. And so it may be that just the drivers has an additional load of being able to try and understand that synthetic speech. So we compared synthetic speech where the computer was reading the texts and messages, or a human was reading them. And then we had an activity that looked at just reading versus reading and trying to compose a message back. So how much of this is just the comprehension and how much of this is production? And then we looked at what happened when you had a system that was perfectly reliable, that didn't make any errors, and one that basically became error prone, like many of the current voice engines are. And then we looked at Siri. Here's our single task, just driving. That's our category 1. Here's our category 5 operation span task, so that grounds us in the same task. This was the synthetic compose. That's what our category 3 level of workload before was. You listened to messages and then basically composed a message. And so we got the same score with using computerized speech to send and receive texts and short emails. But there's no difference whatsoever between the synthetic and the natural. It says that it's not the synthetic speech that's creating the problem. It's something else. We can also look at what happens when you're just listening to the messages that are presented. Some cars will actually let you just listen to the messages. And you can see that there's no difference there between having a computer read the message versus having a human read the message. But about half of that interference is due to the productions part of it, where you're actually speaking, and about half of that interference is because you're actually listening. So you can kind of break apart the typical voice, speech to text kind of stuff. Part of it is, about half of it is I'm actually generating speech, and half of it's just trying to understand what is being said. When we go from an error-free system to an error-prone system, that increases the workload. And using Siri in the earlier versions to just with your phone to try and send text messages or do kind of various search queries, now all of a sudden that pushed the workload to 5. Using a kind of a Siri-based system, a real system now, was 4 on our 5-point scale. So a little cause for concern, because now we're actually, if you look, every car company now has some kind of a voice engine that goes in the car, so the driver pushes a button, and their experience when they're actually interacting and speaking with this is probably more like a 4 or higher. So we wanted to expand this idea from just looking at just typical college students to people across the age range. So our next version of this work looked at people between the age of 21 and 70. You'd expect that older drivers might have more difficulty using this technology, and that turns out to be the case. And we also looked at practice. So what we did in this case was we brought somebody in, let them actually drive the car and be familiar with the car. And then we gave them the keys for a week and said, go out and drive the car. You could have the car for a week, go wherever you want, drive to Las Vegas from where I live, and practice using the technology, and come back 1 week later and let's test and see how you've done. The reason is if practice eliminates perhaps the distractions of using that technology, then maybe our concerns are just short-lived. And so after you figured out how to use the car, it won't matter. So let's just see what happens if we give people a week of using this technology. So we tested 10 different OEM systems, 10 different vehicles. This is in 2015. And we also tested using Siri, Apple Siri, Google Now, and Microsoft Cortana. Both Apple Siri and Google Now kind of have slightly morphed into Android Auto and CarPlay. talk a little bit about that in a bit. But we had people, as they're driving, dialing or selecting music or doing some voice texting. And here's an example of that route. People are driving on the roadway. Every so often as they're driving, they would be told, hey, I want you to tune the radio. And then you'd use your voice to push a button, use your voice to perform some operation to change the radio, tune the radio, select some kind of music. And so this little red interval is kind of the time that we would say that they're actually using their voice to perform that activity, at which point they finished it. And then there's this little blue area here, which is kind of the washout period where they finished that task and now they're just presumably driving, and so that should be back to single task driving. And then they'd be told at some point, hey, you need to place a call. They would use their voice to send a call or place a call, and then there'd be this washout interval where they would basically be now just driving without distraction. And we would refer to these in the jargony terms of in-vehicle information system. So IVIS-1 means you're actively talking to the car. You're actually interacting with that technology. And IVIS-0 means that you had been using that technology, but now you're no longer doing it in this washout period. We wanted to know, how does the blue compare to the red? And how does the blue compare to just driving without any of these sources of distraction? And so we can look at this. This is just in this particular case, we're looking at just the workload of basically using the DRT. Here's our single task. Oh, my battery's dying. So here's our single task category 1, just driving and not performing any of these activities. Here's doing the category 5 workload, this high level of operation span task. So we can see that we're using that same low and high bounds for the workload. What you see is if people are actively talking to their car, their workload is close to, just a little bit below that category 5 operation span task. So this is with real-world cars using real-world systems. It's very difficult to use. When they stop, when they get from that pink area to the red area, what we're seeing is that there's a big difference between speaking and not speaking. So there, that pink to blue, you're getting some kind of oscillation in terms of demanded versus difficult driving and interacting with that technology versus not. But we also see that in that blue interval, you've finished talking, you're just driving, but you still have a pretty substantial residual cost. The kind of a carryover of the fact that you've been interacting with that technology. So we can look at that more carefully by saying, what happens is so these are a large cost, what happens if we look at our switch costs? And so here's our measure of category 5 operation span task. Here's our single task. Oh, stop. That's interesting. It's going to give me the whole talk like that, but I can fix that. We'll try again. Operation span task, single task, and then we looked at 3-second intervals in that blue period from when I just stopped interacting with the system, 3 seconds later, 3 seconds later, 3 seconds later, and the question is, how quickly do I transition from being in that high level of distraction to performance of single task? And it follows a power function. Turns out that at up to 27 seconds, you're still significantly impaired. The biggest impairments, of course, are right at the front end. But this is that residual cost that actually significantly persists for up to 27 seconds. If you looked at the psychological literature, you'd have said that this should have been much shorter. What we're seeing is that there's a kind of a really significant carryover of using your voice to try and communicate with the vehicle. Even after you've stopped talking to the car, you're still suffering from the kind of lingering effects of that interaction. And to give an idea, we've recently studied this more systematically using a driving simulator. And so we have a situation where you're driving in a relatively easy driving environment. I'll just go over here. An easy driving environment where there's very little traffic. We have a hard kind of uneven flow driving environment. And what happens is you start to do something like, in this case, instead of talking, we had people counting backwards by either 1s or 3s. And so Counting backwards by ones is the red interval here. That's relatively easy, and so you're counting backwards by ones. And this is measuring using the DRT again to measure this. And then here's our counting backwards by ones, is the blue, and counting backwards by threes is the red. So a higher level of distraction from counting backwards by threes than ones. When you stop counting, then what happens is you get this nice power function again that persists for a substantial period of time. You see the same pattern with more difficult driving, and so again, here's our counting backwards by ones, counting backwards by threes, and then a kind of a switch cost that persists for multiple seconds, in this case 30 seconds or more. We see the same kind of thing with accuracy. So in terms of detection, your accuracy in responding to the detection reaction time task, it's greater when you're counting backwards by ones than it is threes, suggesting there's more distraction from counting backwards by threes. And these effects that kind of take about 30 seconds to wash out. So we see that same pattern either on the road or in carefully controlled studies using a driving simulator to manipulate the load and driving difficulty. Yeah. If we look at practice, the blue indicates the performance on the first day we tested. The red is a week later after they had a week of practice. And there is a practice effect. You do see that there are some benefits. But what happens is that the differences are relatively minor, and the differences between the operation span task and using your voice still are pretty high. So a task that's difficult to use on the first day stays hard to use even after a week of practice. And given the power law of learning with respect to practice, we'd expect the biggest effects of practice using that system to be manifest in the first week. And so it does suggest that if you have a system that's hard to use, you're kind of stuck with that car for as long as you have it. In terms of looking at the effects of age, we looked across the age range. We see that in terms of the differences between younger and older adults just when driving, we see that reaction time is elevated. This is consistent with the generalized slowing we typically see with age. One of the things you do see, though, is that when older drivers are interacting and using their voice to communicate with that technology in the vehicle, they tend to actually show much greater impairments, doubling relative to just driving alone. So basically you're getting this. The older drivers are showing a substantially greater impairment from when they're actually using their voice to interact with this technology. Oddly enough, more than likely, the people who are buying these cars with all this new technology are the older drivers. So they're buying this technology. They're most likely to buy it, and they're most likely to have the difficult struggle using this technology. So this next part, I'll kind of finish with this last part here, which is kind of building on the kind of work that Mike Regan is planning to do, which is to look at interactive kind of multimodal complex interactions. Right now, if I buy a car, I might push the button to initiate some kind of an action. I might then speak some, navigate to the nearest coffee shop. Then something may be displayed on the screen, and I might have to reach over then and scroll up and down to identify what I want. Select that. It may then start to give me turn-by-turn directions to get there. I may still have to kind of give some more voice-based interactions. And so it's not just using your voice, it's not just cognitive, it's basically this combination of complex visual, where your eyes are off the road for periods of time to interact with the touch screen, manual, where you're not having both hands on the wheel, and cognitive sources of distraction. And so this combination of the three represents what's really in the vehicles now. It also represents a much, much more demanding kind of interface to kind of interact with. And so you can think about some things that might be low, easy to do, moderate, or really demanding. And we asked really simple 3 questions. There are different kinds of task types that people can do. I can select music, I can place a call, I can try and send a text message, or I can do some kind of navigation operation. And there are variations on each one of those, but we looked at those kind of 4 general task types. You can then interact with it using the typical touchscreen on the center stack. So you just might reach over and make some selections on the touchscreen that's usually the same display that's used for the backup camera. You can use your voice, so the interactions may be totally voice-based. Push a button and say, call Mike Regan. Or in some of the cars, they now have a whole separate display that's in the center console, and it might have a rotary dial. It might have a write pad where you can, some of the cars actually kind of like an etch-a-sketch. It actually would write out the numbers or letters of where you're trying to go. Seems to be something where they've designed something without really thinking about whether it's a good idea to pair with the car. Oh, and just as a quick note, one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the work that Mike's planning to do is we expect that the demands that we see with especially these center console interactions are going to be substantially greater in Australia than they are in the US. Because in the US, we drive on one side of the road where you're primarily holding the hand with your left, holding the steering wheel with your left hand, interacting with all that touchscreen rotary dial technology with your, for the most part, for most drivers, with your dominant hand. It'll flip here, and so now you're having to like spell out things and do fine motor movements with your non-dominant hand. The expectation and predictions, I think, would be you'd find substantially, whatever we're seeing in the US is probably going to be even harder in Australia. We tested 50 different vehicles, and we did a comprehensive assessment. I'll show you a little bit about that. We did the single task, which should have people just driving. We also did an end-back task, which is another measure like the operation span task. It provides a high cognitive demand. And we use another task which measures visual demand. It's a surrogate reference task. And the cognitive demand, the end-back task would be, you'd hear a series of auditory numbers being presented, and then you have to say, is that number the same as the one you heard 2 back? Is 2 the same as the one you heard back? Is 4 the same? This is pretty difficult to do. It produces a high level of cognitive load, so it's a measure of cognitive demand. We also did the surrogate reference task, and so this is a task, it's another ISO, a variation on the ISO standard. What you need to do is just identify the larger circle in that display. See it? And you just reach over and touch it. It's on a little iPad mini. And so it controls and tests for high levels of visual manual demand where I have to look and identify something on the screen. And the last thing we did, so we then took a whole bunch of measures, DRT measures, workload measures, and task time. How long does it take to perform the task? And just give you a flavor. If you have not been in one of these vehicles, I'm just going to scroll through. These are some of the vehicles we tested. Get an idea about the complexity of some of these vehicles. Multiple displays, multiple buttons. In some cases, some of the vehicles had over 200 multifunction buttons that were allowed the driver to interact with while the vehicle's in motion. Displays, small screens, larger screens, numbers of buttons on the steering wheel, multiple screens. Just kind of show you some of the complexity. These vehicles now have had a tremendous amount of complexity, but they haven't actually been tested to figure out if this stuff actually works very well for drivers. And so you get an idea about how some of the complex types of designs and systems look. And just quickly, you get an idea about what the cars are looking like. Here's the Tesla. So it's got a 17-inch monitor and has all the features and characteristics that we saw. GM, Dodge. The question is, does the task type matter? Does it matter what kind of task you're performing? And the answer is, this is measuring cognitive demand. And so we see high levels of cognitive demand for all 3 tasks. In terms of visual demand, it turns out that by the way this is set up is, this is visual demand. 0 is single task driving. 1 is, the red line there would be how demanding it would be to do that surrogate reference task while driving. And so anything above 1 is harder than that ISO standard. And so calling and dialing and texting are at that level of the surrogate reference task, but doing navigation or the audio entertainment actually has higher load. This is task time. How long does it take? And the idea is that these interactions, generally to be low levels of workload, should be relatively short. If you have to take a real long time, like navigation is taking about 1.5 to 2 minutes, that's too long to be continuously interacting with that technology while you're driving down the road. And so 1 in this case is 24 seconds. It's derived based on pulling out information from the NHTSA visual manual guidelines. Anything to the left of that red line is going to take less than 24 seconds. And so audio entertainment, calling and dialing, in terms of task interaction time, are lower than that. Texting is significantly longer than the 24 seconds, and doing the navigation, destination entry kinds of things is much higher. And when we pull all this stuff together, there we go, this is our overall level of demand. There's two things that, in terms of the types of tasks people can do while they're driving down the road, that are below the red line, selecting music and placing calls. And two things that actually are significantly above that red line, cause for concern in terms of safety. One is using the texting features of the vehicle, and one is programming destination entry. Both those latter categories are activities that are recommended by NHTSA not to be enabled while the vehicle's in motion, but 70% of the cars we tested allowed drivers to interact with texting while driving, and 40% of the vehicles we tested allowed people to do destination entry while the vehicle's in motion. So fairly high level of exposure and a fairly high level of distraction. In terms of the different kinds of interactions, what we see is that they're all having high levels of distraction. The touchscreen tends to be a little easier and a little quicker. The voice-based interactions are significantly more distracting, and hardest of all are the center console types of interactions, the rotary dials and right pads. And if we look at the different vehicles, this is kind of rank orders some of the vehicles that we tested, from the ones that are easiest, like the Chevy Equinox, which is, there's about 7 of the vehicles there in this particular slide, were below the red line. They're actually, in terms of kind of using the industry standards of ISO for workload and visual demand, and kind of looking at the NHTSA visual manual guidelines, would actually meet those criteria. 11 are basically not significantly different from that, and 12 of the vehicles were actually significantly above the demands that are being placed on the vehicle. So that actually suggests that many of the types of cars that are currently on the market and available to drive are too demanding in terms of the that suite of electronic technology that you can use. What I think I'll do at this point, our next phase deals with autonomous vehicles, and Mike and I can attest to the fact that that's a can of worms that we're just starting to understand. I think I'll at this point stop and entertain any questions you may have. And if you want to know more about autonomous vehicles, I can tell you about that offline, or Mike can tell you about it as well. So.
Thank you, Dave. Could you join me in thanking Dave, and then we'll ask him some questions. I have to say, as someone who's read quite a number of Dave's reports over the last couple of years, it was a really elegant summary of everything you've done. It's something I didn't even understand until we had this talk this morning, so that's really going to help me to bring it all together. So are there any questions? Does anyone have a question for Dave? Max?
You might have missed it, but your 1 to 5 scale, was that based on the secondary reaction time task entirely, or was it an integral or some weighted combination of all of those different measures that you used?
It's
how did you produce them?
It's an integrated weighted scale of all the different measures. So I just showed in some cases the DRT because it provides kind of a real fine-grained analysis. It provides kind of the level of resolution that provides us to let us look at things like, you know, residual costs. But in terms of the 1 to 5 rankings that were done prior, it was basically integrating the single task, secondary tasks, subjective measures, and physio measures, like ERPs and everything like that. They're all integrated into that one metric. And to do that, we would initially standardize everything using z-scores, and then kind of integrate it so that each thing was weighted appropriately. And then the tasks were anchored by the single task and the operation span task. So, yeah.
So there wouldn't be a way to get a separate single measure of a task based on that 1 to 5 scale. It would have to be based on the combination of metrics that you used in any given situation.
No, if you want to look at extremely long reports that we have, we break it out by every dependent measure and by every different task. So you could, if you wanted to, say what would happen if we changed the weighting system, got rid of the physio measures because we didn't think they were, say, reliable, only focus on the DRT, excluded the DRT. That, first of all, the data is available, so if you ever want to play around with that stuff, it's all set up so you can actually play around with sliding scales for weighting different kinds of things. We had no basis for necessarily weighting any tasks differently, or any dependent measures differently, so they were equally weighted, but they wouldn't have to be. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Just in your phase 1, in your DRT light test, am I correct that you had this light on the car, and when the light was bucking, the driver actually indicate I am seeing the light?
That's one version of it, yes.
That's what. Why is the test not having multiple lights on the screen? Because for example, if I know that there will be a light coming up at this point, I will be focusing on this point until the light comes up. But if I'm not sure where the light is coming up, that would be a different scenario, wouldn't it?
So there's a number of ways you could configure the DRT to ask slightly different questions. One version of the DRT actually uses a kind of vibrotactile stimulus that actually is attached to your collarbone, so it doesn't matter where you're looking. You could even close your eyes and you can still measure the attention associated with that. So in that particular case, we're not so worried about exactly where you're looking. There's another version of it we've used that you wear a little headband, so no matter where your head is positioned, the light will always appear at a fixed position relative to the center gaze. The version that I showed you is another version we've tried where it's projected right onto the center roadway, so that if your eyes are taken off the road to look at some center stack interaction, you'll miss that DRT stimulus. So it provides a way of getting an idea about how much visually distracting an activity would be. Most of our studies that looked at cognitive distraction either use the vibrotactile stimulus or that stimulus where the light was held in a fixed position regardless of where your head position was. But the version I just showed you was one that allowed us, and it's what we've used most recently, to look at both cognitive distraction and visual distraction. And if you're not looking at the forward roadway, you will miss that stimulus, but if you are, you won't. And so it gives us a measure that's similar to what you might expect to get if you're using an eye tracker, where you can actually see, how often. What we would like when people interact with this technology is for them not to take their eyes off the road for prolonged periods of time. What we know from just the odds ratio is that odds ratios of crash is that if you take your eyes off the road for more than about 2.5, 3 seconds, you start to see a significant increase in crashes. And so some of the technologies that I was showing you have eyes off road for 20, 30 seconds. So that's an activity that we know is likely to have significant impairments. And so using the DRT as it was configured with the light projected at the forward roadway gives us a measure of task time and how much of that task time is where your eyes aren't focused on the forward roadway. But we've tried every one of those combinations, and it kind of depends how we're configuring them with the kind of question. Most recently, we're interested in, as is Mike, how much, cognitive, but also how much visual manual distractions there are. And so that's why it's configured like that.
It's a very good question. Carl.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I wondered about the call task. It's placing a call, is a real person they're calling and are they having a conversation, or is it like a prank call?
So for each of those task types, there are variations on what they would be. So in one case, they're dialing a number. In another case, they're dialing something from a call contact or list, or they're basically calling like their own number. So a number they're familiar with, a number that they're not familiar with, or a number of their call contact list. We're not looking at the conversation part of it, just the place a call to Mike Regan, say. And once that call would have gone through, they would hang up.
The task ends.
Yes. So it doesn't at all measure how distraction the conversation. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there any evidence or even speculation on why the recovery follows a power law? Any underlying mechanism for that?
Well, what we think is happening, and so this is an open hypothesis we've been testing, is that you've lost your situation awareness during that interval of time when you're interacting with the technology, and that it's taking time to recover that situation awareness. And the situation awareness would involve things like now scanning again, now attending to the environment. And so what you're seeing is the kind of residual effects of recovery of situation awareness after it's been lost. That's one hypothesis.
I've got another one that I'll mention too, that I'll mention today in a moment.
Go ahead.
It's called the hysteresis effect, and they looked at it in aviation pilots after they'd... Oh, thanks, Dave. There's an Australian guy, Ron Cumming, actually, who wrote a really good paper on this hysteresis effect, and basically the idea is that you experience a high level of workload, and what happens is after the load goes down, the cognitive effort doesn't reduce when the load disappears, and they claim that it's something to do with the sort of refractoriness of the inner workings of the mind. Basically, it's like the psychological refractory period, I think they used to call it in the old days, and so you've still got sort of like an attentional limitation sort of going on that prevents you from multitasking for some time after the load goes down. And so that's what I've said for many years. Why would you have a pedestrian crossing after a roundabout? Because a roundabout's a fairly high workload environment. And if this effect is going on and people are loaded up and they go through the roundabout, even though they get through the roundabout and the load's gone, they've then got a pedestrian crossing with pedestrians, and because of the refractory period or the hysteresis effect, they're probably less likely to detect pedestrians that are there and more likely to hit them. So that's another possibility. I had a question, and then I'll come back to yours because I just don't want to lose the question I've got in my head at the moment. I was particularly interested in the comment you made about the fact that when people are talking to passengers and talking on a phone, whether it's handheld or hands-free, that you had an increase in cognitive load. But when you look at the odds ratios, and these are a sort of metrics of degree of change in risk when someone's involved in a distracting activity. So you find that when people are texting on a phone, that the odds ratio is something anywhere between 6 and 10 typically. Right. So that means there's 6 to 10 times increase in the likelihood of you having a crash if you're texting. What you find is that when people are having a conversation on the phone, as Dave said, they typically find that even though you've demonstrated that it increases load, it doesn't necessarily increase crash risk, and some people have actually found that it reduces crash risk. So you talk on a phone, and it's safer to do that. Now, a couple of colleagues of mine, I don't think any of them are here in the room at the moment, just had accepted for publication in Accident Analysis and Prevention a paper that talks about the reasons why we might have that mismatch, because I think it's quite a fascinating thing, and we did a bit of an analytical study to try and sort of tease it all out. But my question is, what would you predict the odds ratios would be for something like telling a system what to do? So for speech control, so even though it's up there near the OSPAN in a cognitive workload sense, what would you predict the odds ratio might be for some of those activities? They're going to be up there with texting? Are they going to be, will we have a protective effect, like when you're talking on a phone? I haven't thought about it. Might be a neat study that we could do or sort of speculate about, but yeah. Over to you.
It's a real good question. One of the things is, you can measure the cognitive load, you can measure the visual demand and so forth, but what we haven't measured, and one of the things you have is we haven't measured kind of when people choose to use this technology. And so if you look at texting, on average it's like 6 to 8. But if you look at when people text, a lot of times they'll do it at traffic lights when they think it's safer, and they're stopped. The problem is, of course, once they start to move, they're distracted because they haven't been paying attention and so forth. But what that means is that there may be certain kinds of activities that will vary in load vary in crash risk depending on when people choose to do it. The various kinds of things that we found well exceed that O-span task or the NBAC task. They're really, really hard to do. That may be a saving grace in terms of crash risk and odds ratios, because they may be so demanding and the system's so poorly designed that people try them for a little bit and say, I'm not using this. In fact, a lot of people said, my voice command the voice system in my car is rubbish. I just stopped using it. So even though if they did use it, I would expect that the odds ratios for continually trying to program destination entry, for example, while you're driving on the streets in Sydney, if you did it all the time, that would actually be an activity that would not be safe to do. But it may well be the case that because at least right now the systems it's so hard to use and the systems are so poorly designed that it may be the case that people don't do it. So we worry about how distracting something is, but you have to also factor in the exposure. And so I think part of it is, and part of the reason why you see these fluctuations in odds ratios is that the exposure, you have to have different kinds of studies to try and measure exposure than you do the distraction potential. And you need kind of either some kind of naturalistic types of studies or studies that kind of measure just how often people are interacting with that technology. And even though navigation is an activity that makes no sense for a driver to be doing based on the workload estimates we have and common sense, it just may not prove to be as much of a problem just because people may not do it. Although we are seeing people do it. But I would say that if you could control for exposure so it was about the same, my guess is actually it's going to be, say, doing destination entry, given the amount of time you're distracted, is going to be at least as bad as texting. Yeah?
With the way you tested the speech-to-text function, did you actually create like a perfect voice assistant? Because that doesn't really seem possible yet.
So how did we do that? You're right that Siri is not perfect and Android Auto is not perfect. What we did was we put a person in the loop. It's called Wizard of Oz type technology. And so if I use any kind of phone or anything that's in the car right now, it will not be perfect. But if I put a person in the loop and you tell me to send a text to Mike Regan, then what happens is I can perfectly transcribe exactly what you said and it will make no errors. So it's you're obviously not going to have a personal assistant in the car transcribing everything you had that you wanted to do, but it provides kind of a test case of what a perfect system would be. So in the event that they ever get these voice assistants so they don't make mistakes, then that would be one way of testing it.
Would you expect that to have like comparatively lower workloads because it is a system that works perfectly in comparison to something like text messaging where you might make typos and mistakes?
And it does, yeah. So when you have a perfect system like we showed in that very first phase, that a perfect system had a kind of a workload of 3. Using Siri to perform almost the same kind of functions had a workload of 4. So a substantially greater increase. And then using the more complex visual manual types of interactions coupled with voice systems exploded it even higher. But a perfect system that you push a button, you place a call, you push a button and you send a message. If there's no errors in that system, you'll still have workload that's probably higher than just talking to a human on a phone call.
Any other questions for Dave? We're sort of over time, but you're all interested people, which is good. And there's a bit of food over there too afterwards. I just had one more issue to raise.
There you go.
It's actually an important issue that hadn't occurred to me before, and that is that you've talked about this hysteresis effect, or whatever we call it. When people in naturalistic driving studies are developing these odds ratios, they have to choose sort of baseline periods that they choose as sort of their baselines in calculating these odds ratios. And I'm not an expert in this area, but it occurs to me that the period that you choose as the baseline is really critical in light of this hysteresis finding, because you could be choosing a baseline that you think is a baseline period when they're not engaged in any secondary activity, and hence the workload should be low. But in fact, you could be choosing a baseline that's a period during which there's a hysteresis effect, and this would totally change the odds ratios. So it's a can of worms. I mean, we wrote this paper without actually thinking about this issue. I wish we'd submitted the thing a month later, because we would have tried to build this into it as well. That's something that hadn't occurred to me, but we can talk about it this afternoon.
Sure.
So if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank Dave again for an excellent discussion. He really did convey a lot of information in a very simple way this afternoon. It's a complex area. And we're actually replicating the work that he's done here in Australia and actually extending it a bit, so we'll be collaborating further, and happy to chat more about this at another time. So thank you for coming, and if you want to chat more with Dave after this, please do. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.